do join. Okay. Well, good evening and welcome to this All-American Family Week seminar, Why Does Food Insecurity Persist Even Though We Waste 40% of All Food? I am Diana Burley, Vice Provost for Research, and it is my pleasure to serve as the moderator of this evening's discussion. Since joining AU a little more than a year ago, I have been continually impressed with the impactful research conducted by our faculty and researchers across campus. Our change-making faculty members address some of society's most pressing challenges, and they do so in the most AU way, across disciplines and through the lens of social equity. During tonight's discussion, I will introduce you to several of our faculty members whose work in environmental sustainability is challenging the status quo and making the world a better place. Let me introduce our panelists, and then we will get into our discussion. First, we have Professor Simon Nicholson. Simon is an associate professor of international affairs in our School of International Service, and he is also the director of our newly minted university-wide Center on Environment, Community, and Equity. Simon's research focuses on global environmental governance, global food politics, and the politics of emerging technologies, including climate engineering and carbon renewal. He is the co-founder of the Forum on Climate Engineering Assessment and the Institute for Carbon Renewal Law and Policy, two scholarly initiatives within the School of International Service. Next, we have Professor Garrett Grady Lovelace. Garrett is an associate professor also in the School of International Service. She researches and teaches global environmental and agricultural policy and agrarian politics. She is a critical geographer by training and draws upon political ecology and decolonial studies to research agricultural biodiversity conservation, agrarian cooperatives, land use decisions, and domestic and global impacts of US farm policies. Her work includes community-based research action with grassroots groups on the Farm Bill and on Cuba-US agricultural relations. Next, we have Professor Sauleh Siddiqui. Sauleh is an associate professor of environmental science in our College of Arts and Sciences. His primary area of research is mathematical optimization and operations research applied to environmental systems, including energy infrastructure, food systems, and human health. He is the principal investigator and director of the newly announced Wasted Food Sustainable Regional Systems Research Network, a $15 million cooperative agreement from NSF, the National Science Foundation, which funds 14 institutions, 40 faculty members, 45 graduate students, and 14 staff members. And finally on our panel, we have Tamber Stevenson. Tamber is a PhD student in our School of Communications. Her research focuses on supporting policymakers and practitioners with a food and health communications research agenda centering on Black women. She is a trained health communicator whose scholarship takes on critical approaches in examining structural communication inequities within under-resourced communities in relation to food and health inequities. She is especially interested in the relationship between communication infrastructure and health outcomes in the District of Columbia. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that you will see just from the introduction of our distinguished panelists, the breadth of expertise that we have here at AU on this particular topic and on the question of why food insecurity persists. In the United States, 40% of food produced is never eaten. And that represents waste in the forms of lost resources and pollution from food production, economic costs to businesses and households, and decreased food security. The United States aims to have waste of food by 2030. This is an ambitious goal, which will require research to generate new knowledge and partnerships. The question is, how do we ensure that our sustainability goals established for our food systems do not get in the way of our goals for equality and resilience? And that's a really critical question because we often consider questions around sustainability in isolation. But here we are talking about looking at the complexity of the challenge and really making sure that we don't solve one problem by exacerbating other challenges. So today, on the International Day of Awareness of Food Loss and Waste, I am delighted to introduce this panel discussion to tell you a bit about the work that we are doing here at American University and to talk specifically about our new NSF-funded funded grant. So with that, I'd like to start off, and I want to start broad with our panel to talk about sustainability at AU and just to talk about some of the research that is being done across the university. And Simon, I'm going to go to you as the director of the center that we will shortly be launching officially to just give us an overview of some of the work that's being done here at the university on sustainability.
Thanks, Diana. Hey, it's bedtime for my little one. Can you hear any squawking in the background?
Just a little bit. It's okay, it's all good.
We might have to go to one of my colleagues if it gets too loud. But let me say thank you, Diana, for the invitation to be with you. Welcome and good evening to everybody who's on the call. Again, my name is Simon Nicholson. I'm an associate professor in the School of International Service. I like to say about American University that environment and environmental work is deep down in our collective DNA. If you look at our campus, we have one of the very first campuses across the nation that has gone carbon neutral. Not just in terms of its on-campus energy use, but in terms of all of the functions of the university, from research through student travel and on and on and on. We have a national arboretum on our beautiful campus. We are the steward of the Airlie Center out near Dulles Airport, just outside of Washington, DC, which is the place where Earth Day was founded. So here, just in terms of American University as a campus, you see some of the extraordinary sustainability gains that have been made and the sort of work that we do. When it comes to academics, we have degree granting programs in each of the schools across the campus. We have our alums from those programs in positions of influence in the private sector, in philanthropy, in think tanks, in non-governmental organizations, in the government, and not just in the US government, but across the world. And then when we look at our research, we have more than 80 full-time faculty on the American University campus devoting their time to trying to understand the complexities of environmental protection and human well-being, and the intersections between those kind of key components of flourishing life on the planet. What we've been missing on the campus are opportunities for connection across the schools. And so the reason that we're launching this new campus-wide Center for Environment, Community and Equity is to make it easier for the sorts of collaborative work that we're going to talk about tonight through Professor Siddiqui's new grant. And one of the ways we're going to kick that off next year is actually through a cross-campus year of climate action, through which we'll have joint programming. We will highlight student and faculty research. We'll bring our staff members and students and faculty together to think about more of the work that American University can do in the world around this most kind of challenging thing that we face collectively right now, which is climate change. I could go on all night about the great work that's happening on the campus, but I think tonight is really a celebration of this new award. And so Professor Siddiqui, Swale, my good friend, congratulations. It's an amazing thing that you're bringing this to the campus. I can't wait to find out more about what you have planned. Looking forward to joining the conversation tonight.
Thank you, Simon. So let's do that. Let's go to you, Swale, and let's hear about this new award. Tell us what it is it intended to do, and a little bit about the network that is involved.
Sure. And thank you, Simon, and thank you, Diana, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. First off, this is not just something that I just pulled out. This was a number of conversations and an extremely collaborative effort that I'll give some specific examples for. But I really think that's the goal behind this grant, is that we need to re-envision how we think about the food system in order to really transform it. And to do that, we can't stick to some of the old siloed language that we sometimes speak within disciplines, but also sometimes within ways of thinking about it. So we started with the goal of thinking about wasted food. And we said, well, how do we go about tackling this goal? And if you think of the food system as a straight line, all the way from production to manufacturing to distribution to consumption, food gets wasted at each part of that line. And most of it is wasted at the consumption level. But we wanted to take a step back and say, wasted food is not just a problem. In many ways, it's a symptom. And so let's think about thinking of wasted food as an opportunity and a resource to retransform our food system, which also has these host of other problems with it beyond just the fact that we waste food. And so one of the visions for this grant, one of the ambitions for this grant, is that we, instead of thinking of our food system as just a linear system, when we can just look at individual parts, let's think of it as a circular system that kind of folds upon itself, and where different parts are connected, and we have opportunities to reduce, reuse, and valorize any food that's being wasted. Now, coming with that, concurrent with that, with the topic of today's webinar on, despite us wasting up to 40% food, why does food inequity still exist in the United States? Well, that goes back to this idea that we need to fundamentally rethink our food system and transform how we think about it and what the food system is. And I'll give you a perfect example from this. So in the early stages of the grant, a bunch of us faculty, the initial faculty who were together, were trying to discuss a definition of wasted food. And we started talking about a banana peel. And we're like, is a banana peel wasted food or not? And, to some of the engineers in the room, they said, well, yeah, because if it's something that can be used for energy later, or composting, or something else, like we can use it somewhere. And then the people who were studying health were said, not really, because you can't eat the banana peel. So what's the point? Like we should totally not think of it as wasted food. And the economists in the room sort of said, well, I don't know. It depends on where the banana peel is and where it came from. So it sounds like a big joke, and in many ways you can kind of think of like the experts in food systems kind of having this argument, but that shows you how siloed different disciplines and different sciences have become, and why AU is so important in thinking about tackling this problem. And so we approached it from this broad perspective, but one of the things I realized, especially once I talked to all my colleagues at AU, which by the way was so easy. Simon introduced me to someone who told me I should go to Professor Malini Ranganathan's talk. From there, I met, she told me that I should reach out to Garrett, and then she also told me I should reach out to Tambra. And so I've been having like these amazing individual conversations, and each of them shaped what this grant turned into. And I'm gonna tee it up for both Garrett and Tambra in this way, because when in conversation with Garrett, we sort of talked about like, well, one of the things we're doing is there's some colleagues at other universities who are looking at frontline workers, because the insights that we can get from frontline workers are incredibly, incredibly important. And Garrett immediately responded and said, no, but you can't just start, it's very important to look at frontline workers, but you can't stop it. You also have to look at workers who work on the farm, and people who work at the direct introduction of it, and introduction of where the food starts. And so I attended one of the webinars that Garrett actually hosted, and learned so much from that on, how our food system, just from where the food starts, it's not just an economic or a chemical or just a physical issue. It's such a people issue. Every time we take any amount of food and we eat it, and for us, a lot of times being removed from that also helps us avoid some of the problems that we see in the food system, and just think of waste as waste, whereas waste, is a sign of some of these deeper problems. And then the first time I met Tambra, and I hope she goes into detail about Wanda and all the wonderful work she started there, which is amazing in itself. But I was talking to Tambra about how we're connecting different infrastructures. So we're connecting energy, and we're connecting water, and we're connecting food. And then right away, the first thing she says was, but why are you forgetting about the communication infrastructure? And I said, well, I'm not really forgetting about it. But I'm not, it's not clear to me where that comes from. And then she was very patient and explained her research to me on how sort of the communication infrastructure really impacts the people who eventually want to get the food to. And so I'm glad you convened this panel, Diana, because right away we get to hear from sort of two different parts of the food system and the people on those ends. And I think I would really want to sort of pass the proverbial mic on to Garrett and Tambra, because I think they'd be able to describe so much better than I did. I learned all that from them, and I'm grateful, and I think that played such a role in getting this grant.
Thank you, and let's do that, because Something that Simon started off talking about was the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary space at AU, where we have folks from all across campus who are looking at questions around sustainability. And initially, I suspect that people would say, well, what is a geographer, a critical geographer? First of all, what is a critical geographer, right? And then how does that relate? And the same for a communications person. Why is that so important? So why don't we go to you, Garrett, and then we'll go to you, Tambra, and let's talk about what you do and why what you do is so critical to a project like this.
Thank you so much, Diana and Sauleh and Simon and Tambra. It's such an honor to share real-time virtual space with you all and with the audience, whom I can't see, but I hear there's lots of people interested in this, which is so heartening, and parents of students and young people whom we're so honored to be teaching in the classroom. So when the food system is talked about, the quote unquote food system, firstly, there's many things. There's many systems and informal systems and survival systems and systems of appropriation and systems of liberation, all woven into what's called the food system. So even just unpacking that or seeing the complexity of that, I think is a beautiful starting point with a lot of pedagogical potential, as well as methodological challenges and opportunities, which I'm excited to dive into with this team and with like 90 other people. It's really amazing, the kind of breadth of this team. So the US, or Turtle Island, food system of this region has deep colonial roots. So it has roots in extreme oppression. Agriculture is the source of oppression and colonialism. Colonialism was agricultural. Enslavement was agricultural. And so the colonial genocide of indigenous people was about land. And about the kind of land appropriation of the Homestead Act. So extricating the food system from that deep history would be a disservice to our students and to the policymakers we're working with. Agriculture has also been liberation. It's been the Haitian Revolution. I see Farming While Black, Leah Penniman's book in the back of Tambra's bookshelf. So there's a whole long history to seeing agriculture as a way toward freedom, Black and Indigenous freedom, but also kind of broader sovereignty, the ability to feed oneself and one's family, even as one's engaged in these broader trade systems and supply chains and labor and migration networks. So there's all of this complexity, but food waste is a very important avenue into the complexity. As Sauleh put forth, it's a symptom of broader dysfunctions of the dominant food system. And so kind of unpacking what those dominant food systems dysfunctions and inefficiencies are. On one hand, it's the dysfunction of a food system, the 40% number. It continues to shock me. Every time I hear it, it's like a gut punch when so many people in our communities and in our neighborhoods cannot afford nourishing food for their children, when the kind of bounty and the surplus is rotting, in the fields and in the landfills. So there's an urgency to food waste, but it's also not just the dysfunction, it's actually emblematic of much of our food system. And there's actually people profiting off of, the food waste and the erasure of food waste. So even understanding the power dynamics of how the systems are ignoring, the kind of dominant systems of externalities is what the economists call it, the things that are not accounted for within the price systems and the dominant market systems that we're thinking through when we think of GDP or import and export numbers and farm gate prices. So in kind of thinking through food waste as an avenue into the broader complexity of food systems, it's very illustrative. And I would say, kind of as I pass the mic to Tambra, whom I'm so excited to hear from, there is an important element of agricultural policy. To this, there is a broader system within the Farm Bill and U.S. agricultural policy that incentivizes overproduction and the overproduction of commodified, highly processed foods. And so the broader malnourishment that's on the consumption end and the food injustices of that are related to the incentive structure, economic and political and governance of agricultural production, which gets into trade issues and all kinds of really fascinating things. So let me pass the mic to Tambra, but I'd love to field questions and think through the various layers of that collectively.
Thank you so much. I'm first so grateful and honored to be a part of just a very interdisciplinary group of talented researchers and partners. Coming from a public health background, we think very interdisciplinary, and so it is such a great opportunity to see that beyond just the public health realm, even though in my opinion, everything is public health. And so coming from a background of health communications at Tufts, where it was more interpersonal communication. What the opportunity of spending the last 2 years as a doctoral student in the School of Communication, and why it pivots great into this project, is looking at the macro issues of understanding the structural dynamics and ecology of communication, and how that overlays this conversation around food systems. We have not always thought about media or communication as a system. Only scholars have had that conversation, but the lay public, no. We just look at our social media, our Snapchat, our Facebook, our Twitter, and not thinking how it plays into this broader conversation. But I think having the backdrop of the COVID pandemic, it really did shift my thinking of how to think about communication, and actually just my research agenda moving forward. It was a public health dream, though it was a nightmare for everyone else when the COVID-19 hit. And so for me, it had me thinking through, if media was a social determinant of health, how does the lockdown of traditional institutions play a role in thinking through how we communicate and access information when we have communities? I live in Ward 8, in home of Anacostia, Hillsdale, Berry Farms communities that have historically been impacted by, at least over the last 50 years, of food insecurities, but also overlay that with communication justice issues or communication inequalities, of looking at how we think about the access of communication systems when we think about how digital divide plays a role, how the release of the Obama phone under the Obama administration was a thing here, of being able to get access to information as soon as possible. We know that the community is early adopters to opportunities, and using social media as a pathway to create those alternative pathways when traditional systems are either have mistrust embedded, misinformation embedded, but those same issues of racial inequalities that we've seen in traditional systems are just following the community into digital systems. And so to be able to unpack that and thinking about food and communication together is something that creates a unique opportunity. And so it speaks to, in essence, the work of WANDA. I had started WANDA before joining American, but the acronym is Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture. And it was really coming from a place of looking at how do we turn what can be seen as my weaknesses as our superpowers, when we see that in the field of nutrition, we have a lack of diversity in nutrition and dietetics, with 2.5% Black dietitians nationally in the field, yet we have more than 25% of the heart disease and diabetes. And how do we, in essence, prepare troops on the ground for this war? And so understanding that education is critical, advocacy skills is critical, and thinking innovative, and not just simply new technologies, but actually unearthing some of the old ways that can just be, have a slight pivot to them, to really understand that all we need is already within our communities, within our women, within our families, and within our foodways and traditions. And so being able to launched the WANDA Academy with the support of DC Healthcare Finance during the pandemic was an opportunity to see how can this idea of this hybrid sisterhood, digitally and physically, create their own form of communication, of circulating information from Amanda, who runs Fresh Food Factory, to Mary, who is starting up the food hall in Ward 7, to Black farmers who are here locally in the community, who are creating their own systems and own opportunities to support one another, and how important it is to examine that, and how we can create the world that we can imagine, and to be a part of that conversation of how does food waste play a role in this? How does it connect to food insecurity? When we have a culture and a value system in my opinion, from what I've seen, even in my own family, of that we never wasted anything, everything was repurposed. And so there's some cultural dynamic around how we think about food that is an opportunity to honor and to remind and reclaim, and how can we communicate those long shared values in an opportunity to where we can change the trajectory of how we think about people, planet, and profit. And to me, that's the heart of sustainability, is to be able to sustain the good and being able to understand that it has to be people-centered in the conversation, because without us, who do we have? And so that's why this team is phenomenal, to be able to see what can we do together.
That's marvelous. Thank you so much. So many things are running through my mind. Before I jump to the next question, which is not going to surprise Simon or Swale, who know me well, I want to make sure that I tell the audience, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We will read them. I will read them out loud, and you can engage with us as soon as you're ready to do so. So I'm gonna turn to my face. So Tamber, you said to you everything is a public health issue. Well, to me, everything is a technology issue. That's what I do. And so when you were talking about social media, you're talking about communication, of course, I'm saying to myself, oh yeah, I see how she's saying communication, but to me, it's a tech issue. It's a tech policy issue, and it's very much something that I would position in that way, which is part of the beauty of these interdisciplinary conversations, right? Because we can look at the same questions from different angles and talk about how they will impact the overall system. But I want to turn, I know, Simon, I know that you've done some work in looking at tech in the sustainability and thinking about this. And so I want to turn to you, and then to anyone who would like to just perhaps advance that discussion a little bit. About what is the role of tech and tech policy, and how does that influence or could it influence this project and the work that you're doing?
That's what I love about being in conversation with you, Diana. I didn't expect the question, and now I have to think really fast to come up with some sort of response. So you're right.
Good. I know you can do it.
so you're right. I had the great pleasure and privilege of working on some global food issues with the Obama administration, with the Feed the Future program, it was called. Back during that administration, looking at at a coordinated US government response to the issue of global hunger. And what that conversation revealed in part was the way that technology and trying to understand the role technology can play around really complex challenges like global hunger can be a great benefit, but can also be a bit of a trap, right? And so let me try to unpack what I mean by that. So if you look at the global food picture, it mirrors in some ways what's happening in the United States, but also adds some complexity. So we have something like 1 billion people on the planet today who are chronically hungry. That is people who don't get enough calories day after day after day, just don't get enough kind of basic food to eat. There are a further 2 billion people also who suffer from micronutrient deficiencies. That is that they're lacking something in the diet. And at the same time, we have about 1 billion people on the planet who suffer so-called diseases of affluence. That is, the food that we eat does not provide us proper nutrition, and we actually suffer because of that. We're overfed. And so as author Raj Patel put it some years ago in a book that he wrote, we have a world that's at the same time stuffed and starved, right? The starting point for that type of analysis is enough food is produced on the planet right now to feed everybody, if that food were equally or equitably distributed, right? And so this food waste lens, or this food waste entry point, is in part trying to help us understand that there is enough food being produced right now for everybody to get enough to eat, but there's something going on that gives too much food of a certain kind to some and keeps food from others. And so maybe the appropriate response is to just grow a whole bunch more food, right? Maybe we can use technologies in the fields, in the production, perhaps in the distribution and in the storage of food and so forth, to make sure that way more food is grown, is kept for longer, and that's the answer to all the problems that we face. And that leads us into conversations about food biotechnology, It leads us into conversations about complex kind of storage, value chains, as they're called in the agricultural space, and so forth. And there's absolutely a role for those sorts of conversations. But here's the problem. If we doubled the amount of food that would get grown, I can promise you there would still be millions, probably close to 1 billion people who are chronically hungry on the planet, right? Because so much of the food that would then be grown would be directed to things that don't benefit the people who are already suffering the worst impacts of a food system that will not serve them. And so as Swale and Garrett and Tomer were pointing to, the complexities here, they don't lend themselves to single shot technological solutions. Technology has a role to play, but technology can often look like it's a way to sidestep social complexity, or it's a way to sidestep politics. It's a way to get around the real work that needs to take place, which is to work out why it is that some people just don't have access to the means of production, or don't have access to the fruits of the system that is already producing enough food to feed everybody, right? That's the work that needs to be done. And so what I really love about this project is that, yeah, that the technological piece is a piece of this, but it's not the be all and end all of a project like this, right? We've got people from lots of different perspectives staring at the same thing and seeing very different things. And in that different seeing, we're going to get to hopefully better answers.
So, I mean, let's think about, because as you're talking, I'm thinking, oh, well, if we grow more food or if we produce more food, instead of the 40% number, it'll be 60% food is wasted or 80% of food is wasted, right? So where do we begin? Swale, I'm going to turn to you and tell us, where are you beginning with this project? What's happening first? How do we begin to attack this problem? And I know that there are a lot of different partners, and perhaps every partner is beginning in a different place, but if you tell us where you're beginning.
So this is where, you know, a lot of the work that scientists do behind the scenes, it often seems like really you're going to wait for that to happen before you start actually doing real work. But it is essential for us to come up with a common language as scientists and as researchers in different areas. And it is important for us to, even if we don't all agree on the fundamental underlying problems, or we all don't understand the underlying fundamental problems, it's important to at least have a set of principles that we agree on, that we're going to work with and stuff. So the first stage for us is we're going to have a series of meetings, and they're actually run by artists and designers, because artists and because we were partnering with the Maryland Institute College of Art and their Center for Social Design. So they believe, but I've seen it in action, is that some of the principles that go into design, where you can sort of really get to the fundamental problem, those can be really beneficial, especially for academics coming from a lot of different disciplines. And so they're helping us really design, and so I'm going to use some lingo that I've heard from the National Science Foundation, which is, you can think of interdisciplinary research as creating a fruit salad. And what we're really trying to do here is create a fruit smoothie. So we don't just want all of us together just talking. We want all of us to kind of start from first principles, get that common understanding, at least a common base, and then sort of start moving from there. So that's the first place that we start off with. But we also have a number of projects that we've proposed that we're going to do, starting from that common base. So, for example, one of the issues in the United States, even if we wanted to have wasted food by 2030, is that we're not even 100% certain where our food goes, where it's wasted, and how much it's wasted. My primary area is energy research, and if you have a gas stove in your home and you turn it on, I can pretty much tell you where that gas molecule came from. However, if you pick up any piece of food in your home, there's no one who has any idea where that food came from, what the resources used were, what the impact on people was when it came through. And so really collecting that information and really understanding the food systems in and outs, that is really our first stage, is really sort of getting to the bottom of that. And we won't just do that we do have technology. We have people working at Louisiana State who are going to work on imaging technology to photograph food and quantify how much food and nutrients were wasted. We have engineers at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign who are working on national level food flows. But that's not where we're stopping. We have we have research that both Garrett and Tamara are going to do, as well as other researchers are going to do, that's purely just qualitative research, really understanding people's relationship with food and wasted food. So I think for us, that's the first stage, is coming up with a common language and then really understanding the food system better, and really having the data to then move forward after that.
Okay. Timber, I want to turn to you, because when he starts talking about common language, you're our communication expert. And so perhaps if you could talk to us a little bit about how you communicate about wasted food, about food systems, and particularly when you are trying to reach into the community and truly make an impact there. What is your strategy? How do you approach that? And how will you approach it with this project specifically?
I'm glad you asked, because part of even just creating Wanda when my daughter was 4 was, how do you make a name that even a 5-year-old can say? And most 5-year-olds or younger speaks in 2 syllables, like Dada, Mama, Wanda. So when I created the character, Little Wanda, I would think about, how do I center her in the conversation? Because ultimately the work that we're doing is changing not only a culture, but a mindset of a generation. And when I worked at Health and Human Services, when we thought about policy, you're looking at a 30-year trajectory, whether it's research coming out of NIH or if it's a policy that changes the way the nation thinks about racism in America. So when you're developing language, I think about her, and I think about, what would I want to say to my daughter, who will be the legacy that we begin planting that seed today. She will reap the harvest. So for me, as a visual communicator, who in my past life, I would be an artist, and I would think about, how do I use language, which is why I love talking about food and using and touching food, because it gives us that ability to communicate in a way that everyone can understand, because everyone has to eat or should be eating. And so how do we think about communicating in a way that visually as well as multisensory connects to people, whether they can see, touch, taste, hear the sound of food, even down to the acronyms of recipes that has been developed for in naming this project, was very smart. And so I want us to continue to use that sense of smartness that actually is something that we would want to say to our own children. That is the language that to me will resonate. I remember working in policy, and it's not about having multi-syllable words for policymakers or anyone else. It's people don't have time. We live in a culture of convenience. So we are not only simply talking to that 5-year-old, but also talking to someone who does not have time to fully digest, process that information. And so how can they receive it in a very succinct, quick way? And so some of that language is part what we know from, as we would say, our momonym. I think there's benefit coming from Oklahoma being on this team, because there are 2 cultures in America. And I come from the one where there's this mindset that we don't have to use all this high proverbial talk. And so when we're thinking about these issues, we have to talk in a way that connects to the average American, no different than if it was a political campaign stomp and you're hitting different communities in rural towns of North Carolina or the Appalachian Mountains. How can you resonate a story? And it is one that has emotional appeal. It centers the human spirit and the tenacity of the American people, and those who want to have these shared values of what the future of America can be when we look through the prism of food.
Yeah, thank you. Garrett, I want to turn to you, because as we talk about culture and language, and I know that a lot of your work focuses on global and global food systems and global agricultural systems. And I'm particularly interested in your work in understanding the US Farm Bill and its implications, right, its impact globally, and how that relates to the work here.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much, Tambra. Such key points. Sauleh and Simon, what a pithy overview of why just producing more food isn't going to solve anything, particularly because the majority of food insecure communities in the US are working in food, have jobs in McDonald's or in Walmart, and are not paid enough to afford, you know, a fresh peach or much less anything organic. Or internationally, the majority of food insecure communities are people who are small scale farmers, who instead of growing food for multi-scalar markets, some domestic, some in a local village or community, and then some, you know, international, have been for a variety of political economic pressures, the best arable land is going for export crops. And those export crops are going into global supply chains where invariably the farm gate price is getting pressed down because farmers are pitted against each other. You know, for a global buyer, we'll say, you farmer in Bangladesh can produce this, and then you in Zimbabwe can produce this. Who can I get this for cheaper from? So there's this kind of downward pressure on farm gate prices, meaning that farmers are putting all of their labor, all of their skill, all of their arable land and fresh water into an export crop that is cheapened by the global supply chain. And then they don't have the funding to buy good food on the markets, much less grow food for themselves. So there's this cycle of dependence and debt and hunger in the wake of this kind of treadmill of overproduction of commodity crops. Producing more food isn't going to solve that, you know, so the deeper work of the policy analysis is going to be needed from an interdisciplinary, intercultural perspective. And there's so much to say on this, Diana, but I'll just kind of briefly say, the U.S. agricultural system, you know, has all these systems have had. Firstly, it has this colonial origin, obviously, and very racialized, very white supremacist, very patriarchal system of who's farming and the yeoman farmer imagery that we've been fed. You know, kind of this dominant model of who farms, which undermines and erases all of the diverse agricultural traditions that comprise these lands and all of the female-led, you know, agricultural and culinary and agrarian traditions. But the dominant kind of farming policy ramped up to incentivize overproduction in World War I. And so farmers were producing a lot of food, you know, to feed Europeans who were in the trenches. And then the price looked really high, you know, of wheat, and they plowed up the prairie. And so what do farmers do when the prices are high? They grow more, you know, they're growing more. Then the Europeans, those who survived World War I, got out of the trenches, went back to their farms, grew their own wheat. Then there was way too much wheat on the global market, prices collapsed. Farmers saw prices collapse. What do farmers do when prices go down? They grow more food, you know, so they're just plowing up the prairies, plowing. And then all of a sudden, you know, prices collapsed, and that led to the Great Depression, that rural agrarian crisis, and to the Dust Bowl, which is man-made. It's all agricultural erosion. So all these farmers, you know, went to DC and said, please help us manage supply, not overproduce, and provide a price floor. Granted, they were largely white men, but it's an important history that acknowledgement of kind of capitalism unfettered will crush, you know, the farm gate price and have all these ecological impacts. And so kind of the Farm Bill has moved from that to more of a, you know, free market, you know, market fundamentalism, which has had debilitating impacts internationally because the US produces so much and then exports it at a subsidized rate to farmers around the world who can't compete with either cheap food aid, you know, either free food aid or cheapened food, and then they go out of business. So then all these farmers actually have been pushed out of business around the world, and then they move into urban cities and oftentimes can't afford, you know, kind of waters that are kind of informal, quote unquote, slums, and they're not really supported. And then there's kind of migration issues from that. But the origin of the agrarian crisis internationally is so important to unpack and understand. And it has to do with this kind of surplus mentality of ag policy. I'll leave it at that, but there's so much more.
Oh yeah, there's much more. I feel like we need to have a second webinar to go into some of these issues much more deeply, but I want to turn to community impact because you've all talked about it. You've all talked about it in both a high level conceptual sort of way and also closer to the ground, but I want to get specific on how this project in particular is tied to the community, in what ways, and then perhaps to project forward a bit and talk about ways that the community can get involved. So Swale, why don't we begin with you, and then I'll ask everybody just to sort of to weigh in from your perspective on the community impact question.
So I'll talk about this project specifically, and then I'll let others talk sort of more generally as well, and they can also mention the project too. But I think for us, the most important thing is to start closest to where we are. Our community at AU are all the students at AU, and the community of AU at large, the faculty, the staff, and everyone else. And so there's a number of educational initiatives that we do have. For example, we're going to be starting the first undergraduate student science journal on food systems. We're also going to be engaging with a lot of undergraduate groups, and a lot of them are already contacting me, as well as through the Office of Sustainability, on different things that they can do to think about food insecurity among our students. It's often something that we, at times, like people can, AU community can think like, well, everyone here has food, everyone here is fine, but it's not true. We have food insecure students within our AU community, and so thinking about ways on how we can tackle those problems and what ideas we can do. I'll just give you one example from another university. They have this mailing list, which essentially any student can sign up for. It's anonymous, so you don't have to give up who you are. And that mailing list essentially goes out whenever there's food on campus that's left over, that's from an event or something that's being thrown out. And so that provides a way, for example, to connect people with food, high quality surplus food that's over there. But of course, that's a stopgap measure, right? Like, we want to be able to develop real sort of solutions that get to the root of the problem. And so we'll be working a lot with undergraduate students. That's what we'll first start off with. Then, I like to think of Washington, DC, and that this is where a lot of work that Tambra does, for example, that also Professor Malini Ranganathan does, for example, thinking about our own city of DC. Tamara mentioned Ward 8. AU is in Ward 3. I'm sitting in Ward 3 right now. If I walk 5 minutes in any direction, I get to a grocery store. Tamara, I think you would probably have to walk several miles to get towards more than one grocery store. So the inequities aren't very far from us. We like to think of food insecurity, but it's right here in our backyard, and it's something that we can do right away. And so the project is very cognizant of that, and we want to make sure that that any impact we do starts with us and starts with the city that we're directly based in. And then we're also partnering with a number of other organizations and other communities. So Wanda is, we're definitely going to work very closely with Wanda and communities they engage. We're also working in schools, and so Dr. Stacy Snelling in health studies, she does a lot of work with schools. So we're working with some of the schools in her and thinking about food inequities as well. And then we're also, like I mentioned, frontline workers. We're going to engage some of the people that Garrett talked about. That some of the people who are facing food insecurity are the people at the front lines of who give us food. And so we're going to engage them to elevate their sort of lived experience to the level of our expertise that we have, and then make sure we're giving something back. So I'll stop there, and I'll let others also talk a little bit more.
Anyone else want to weigh in on the question of impact, community impact?
I guess I would just dive in and just also say one of my other hats is the health chair for our local NAACP DC branch. And our president back in 2018 had made the remarks at LEAD when it came to thinking about sustainability, that social equity is at the heart of it. And sometimes it's seen as an add-on. And so for this particular work, thinking about that triple bottom line of the economy, the environment, and the people has to be centered. We hear the language coming from social enterprise or corporate social responsibility language, but in essence, to be able to have that a part of the conversation in thinking about academic research and understanding how even in our research, as I'm in qualitative methods now, of remembering that our research is supposed to better the society and improve the good that we have, and hopefully help to move the mark in providing those insights. And so to center the community and having Wanda to be a part of that, as well as being able to pull other local partners in the conversation around how have we thought about food waste, how have food waste has been addressed in ways that has not been captured by the academics. That to me is something that is so important to understand, that people have been doing, as I shared earlier, repurposing and making a way out of no way. I mean, that is the heart of a Black woman in America. How do you make $1 out of 15 cents? And so how does that speak to being able to sustain a family, a community, our lives, ourselves, and to capture that through narratives and through just data collection, to me, is really important, of being able to recognize the work that is already being done in communities and what can be done more when we actually change the systemic inequities that have been embedded into the system, and really enable the environment that has been historically disabled for people to fully thrive and sustain their livelihoods and the planet at the same time.
Thank you for that. Let me ask about a different type of impact, and that's policy impact. And Garrett, I know that a lot of your work is focused on policy impact, but can you talk a little bit about the potential policy implications for this project?
Yes, thank you for that. So I'll have two levels of an answer here. One is there's many policy specifics. Even there's a food sharing, food recovery has all kinds of liability laws that actually prohibit good food that hasn't even been served. It's still kind of, this gets back to the campus issue. It's still kind of in prep, ready to be eaten, just preventing it from being distributed. So the kind of decriminalizing, frankly, food recovery and food sharing and food circulating, I think would be key. Obviously regulating corporate actors who are benefiting from this overconsumption, and then the flip side, which is high waste. But I want to go deeper and build up something Tamara was saying, which is the first round of food waste literature. I've been teaching food studies now for a decade. And a decade ago, there actually wasn't much data on this, and it was kind of intuition. We were like, it feels like we're wasting a lot of food, but now there was this kind of robust data collection that's happened, although the methodology is very hard. You know, it's notoriously hard to measure. But the first round of analysis was, it's the household that's the problem. It's because women aren't, you know, have gone to work, and somehow like there's this very dangerous analysis that was putting the burden on behavior, an individual household behavior. And so there was a kind of a pushback from an anti-racist feminist perspective to say the skills of cooking from scratch and of growing one's food, saving seeds, storing, canning, preserving, making soup from scratch, eating all the parts of the animal, eating all parts of the plant, have been so systematically devalued in dominant models of development and education, racialized and feminized in their devaluation, and the classism of devaluing those knowledges, and then blaming people and blaming kind of individuals for not passing those knowledges on and kind of valuing them culturally. So I feel like there's an epistemic, you know, reckoning here, that there's a whole set of skills that have been kind of systematically devalued in very classist, racist, and sexist ways. They need to be revalued and re-celebrated. And as Tamara was saying, kind of recovered, you know, these kind of food waste that use all parts of the animal and these food systems, in addition to the kind of regulatory arm of making sure Whole Foods, you know, is held accountable, or, you know, these Walmart is held accountable for the food waste. They need to be held accountable for a few other things, but we'll leave it at that.
That's great. So, you know, I want to actually, Simon, I want to turn to you, because I am, every time I hear about the project and we talk about the project, I get just overwhelmed with the breadth, right? And so I want to, and Swale, I know that you're the PI, but Simon, you're really responsible for helping to establish a network and a community of researchers, and to take the individual components and all the work that we do as individuals and really helping to pull it together to really frame out sustainability work at AU. And so I wonder if you could just talk to our audience a bit about what it takes to do that. And yeah.
Well, I mean, what it takes, honestly, amazing people like Swale, who are not just top-notch scientists, but are also fantastic managers of people and process. And at the moment, the way that we're set up, Swale is burdened, honestly, with too many functions. He's having to conceptualize or help lead the conceptualization of this amazing project, stitch together the network of people who are going to work on it, and then keep track of all of the moving parts. And over the years of this project, Swale, you're going to get real tired, man, if you're taking on all of those responsibilities. And so what we're looking to build out at the university, Diana, as you know, with your office's support and through this new campus-wide center, are the support mechanisms so that people like Swale can focus on the science, right? So that others of us can pick up some of that administrative burden, can help do the work that keeps this sort of research humming along, and frees up the mental capacity and the time that Tambra and Garrett and Swale are going to need to get this work done. Right, it's an infrastructure thing, and that's not very sexy. It doesn't feel like it should be where we should spend our energy and efforts and so forth. But unless we get those basic kind of systems and infrastructure right, then Swale is going to burn out, and AU is not going to be able to do more of this type of work. And so I'm thrilled that we're going to get this new effort off the ground to catalyze more of the sorts of amazing things that we're seeing tonight.
Thank you. And you're right. No, it's not sexy, right? But I want the audience to really understand the gravity of it. I mean, it is so exciting for us to be able to actualize our dreams and our goals for impacting the world in this way and through a project like this. And so I know that as we get to the top of the hour and people start to turn their attention to questions of, so how can I participate, or how can I help, or how, you know, I mean, that's sort of, once they get excited, and I'm confident that people are excited because I'm excited, and so of course everybody else is too, right? But no, you all, I mean, you really have made this real and engaging. And so as we think about how we as a community, because as a community, everyone who is on this webinar right now is a member of our community and will want to play a role. And so I think it's important that we help people understand that there are many, many different ways that you can play a role in helping this project to make the kind of impact globally that it is poised to do. So I know it's not sexy, but I feel a responsibility to make sure that people understand that. So, so I want to, before I keep going with my questions, we do have a few questions in the Q&A. So I'll ask the first one. Will the study look at calories lost by growing plants to feed livestock instead of growing plants to feed humans?
So I'll field that one, and if people want to add on, they can. But that is a wonderful question because it gets to the bottom of what is wasted food. And so the definition that we're working with right now is food that wasn't used for its intended purpose. And because you're absolutely right that it's not just the food grown that's intended for us to eat, it's the food that we use to feed animals. Even when I teach my intro to environmental science class, and I talk about how, you know, when you eat just a pound of tuna, that's sort of tens of thousands of pounds of phytoplankton that went into making just that pound of tuna, because that's how bioaccumulation and energy transfer works. So absolutely. So we will definitely be considering that, taking that into consideration. For us, that is a part of wasted food. And then, you know, we want to, so looking at calories lost is definitely one aspect of it, but we also want to move a little further than just simplifying towards just calories and thinking in terms of just, you know, energy supplying so that people can eat it. It's not just the calories, it's the ground that it was grown on. It was the people who worked on it to get it to where it was. And so all these resources and everything else also needs to be quantified. So it's not just a loss of calories that we're worried about. We're really worried about all types of waste and all types of ways that we're using resources in the broadest possible way.
Simon, I want to go to you for the next question in the chat. Well, there's one about how people can keep updates, and we'll give you the website at the end of the webinar. So hold on to that one. But the next question, it really goes to, I think, the topic that you brought up, which is how do we balance between making too much food that then gets wasted and not making enough food, and how do we think through that? And so you brought that topic up. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on how we even approach striking the right balance.
Yeah, I was just reading through that question, Diana, and it seems to be focused on, for instance, the dining hall that we have on the American University campus. And the fact that when you have lots of people eating in one place, there's going to be a trade-off between, hey, let's make sure everybody has access to everything on the menu, versus making sure that only enough food is produced for those who are in the dining hall at a particular meal service. And I don't know the answer to that question, and it bothers me that I don't know the answer, right? And so I don't know, Sandra, Garrett, Swale, whether you have insight on this, but it does strike me that as we're thinking about where research might take place, I mean, having research take place in our dining hall is something that's actually happened before around food waste questions with science classes that we have, working out whether having just plates versus having trays reduces the amount of food waste that is present in that dining hall, right? It was a project that took place on our campus a couple of years back. It feels like there's actual research that needs to be done to answer this sort of question.
Garrett, do you have any thoughts on that?
I was just going to also say that there's been student leadership on this kind of campus auditing. But the thing with student leadership is that then the students graduate, and then there's like a lack of institutional, memory about that. But I think this project allows for institutional memory, so that the previous iterations of really brilliant and brave student leadership, hi Talia, great student, have happened previously, and how we can build upon that. But I feel like what's needed to happen is just an institutional culture of auditing of food waste, so that every campus knows how much is there, and then it's part of the student curriculum. Even understanding methane emissions from landfills is part of kind of a general education, understanding the food farm worker issues. If food waste were a country, it would be the third leading greenhouse gas emitter. That's an FAO data. So if that was part of kind of curricular knowledge and student ethics and kind of campus principles, then I feel like some of these kind of micro decisions about TDR, offerings, there'd be a collective kind of expertise to weigh in and do some really smart and thoughtful collective self-governance. To have food be celebrated. I think part of food waste, the antidote is to celebrate eating together and cooking together, and then being very conscientious and mindful about how much is consumed, and then where it comes from, and the broader impacts from an equity issue.
Yeah. But I know we have the journal, so it could be that's something that could be in that. Swale.
If it's okay, I'll make a very quick comment, because I think this is another place where, and this touches on something that Garrett had mentioned earlier, and that Tamara had also talked about, is that it's the way we look at food, right? If we look at food as something that just starts somewhere and ends somewhere, and then we try and shame ourselves or someone else on like, hey, it's your fault because you're in this part of the line. That's where it gets troublesome, and it gets hard to solve the problem. You won't solve this problem by plugging gaps. Even if we become the most conscientious people that decide the large, broader problems of our food system will not be solved there. And so this is one of the reasons why this concept of circular economy, it becomes sort of relevant. And I'm not saying that everything about circular economy is great and whatever, but the concept of like, let's not think of the food system as a start and a finish. Let's think of it as a circle. Let's think of it in ways where we can think of, if waste is produced, what is the best way that we're utilizing it? If we can think of ways in which we don't want to eat certain food and it's there, but it's very high quality surplus, what are other ways and other things we can do with it? Where we don't shame certain ways that food is eaten and food is used. So I think all of those fit into this one concept of not thinking of it as start, finish, but let's think of it as a circle that goes around, and where all the opportunities in that circle.
Yeah. So you put in the chat wastedfood.american.edu. That is the website. So please make note of that, everybody. Wastedfood.american.edu. That's where you can keep track of all of the activities that are going on with the project. Simon, you were going to say something.
I'm getting excited by this dining hall question. And so, I mean, wouldn't it be a neat thing to strive for a zero waste dining hall on our campus, right? To kind of center that as a goal, and to work collectively towards that goal, to find out what it would take to make that real. And I can imagine different pathways to that goal. I mean, in part, we could, for instance, ask people to place their orders ahead of time and make sure that only the food that is asked for is available in the dining hall at a particular meal serving, right? And kind of deal with it that way. Or there might be ways to kind of celebrate the preparation and consumption of food in ways that kind of get people together in that dining hall in a completely different fashion than is currently the case, that might lead in a different way to the same outcome. So getting to kind of explore those different possibilities, right? And using our campus as a laboratory, that's one of the great things about AU. we have this kind of thriving on-campus environment that allows us to be exploratory and investigative. And then our laboratory, of course, extends beyond our campus into the city, right into the communities that have been talked about and into the hallways of power on Capitol Hill and beyond. And so, you know, the project is going to have enormous reach, but it can kind of, as you've hinted at, Swale, be centered on our campus in kind of really interesting ways.
I love it. Love it. There is another question in the Q&A. Timber, I'm going to go to you for this because you have such great experience in communicating with the community. This question is specifically about composting and how to convince community members to do it and to adopt that practice. And so, you know, what strategies have you used? And I know you've spoken some about the language in Little Wanda, but perhaps you could go a little bit further and talk about, to speak to this question.
Well, it's two ways, right? It's kind of like the guy who has the car dealership. And if I'm a really good salesperson, you need to have the cars. And so in this case, especially when it comes to urban environments like DC, do people have the infrastructure, the equipment to even compost in the first place? And so in order to communicate that and mobilize people, we have to have systems in place to do that. We know we have CAP compost and we have Food Recovery Network. You know, there are organizations on the ground that are trying to percolate and give these opportunities breath by working with city government. I also serve on our DC Food Policy Council. And so for me, even being a part of this project is going back to our council to say, what is our conversation on food waste as we think about the new year and setting priorities, as the co-chair on nutrition and health, thinking of how are we communicating, because the reality is we need to legislate an FTE on communication within the council. And so the opportunity to think about composting in the midst of the pandemic, I'm sure a lot of us, including myself, have become plant moms. And so even just growing plants, begin that start no different than when we were in home economics, if we remember that class back in the day, where we started with the pet egg. And if you can work with the egg, maybe one day you can graduate to the baby. So for me, that's what the plant, can I grow a plant to even know the beauty and the symbolism of what composting can do in order to provide that to the city government if we have those systems in place. So it's a supply chain. if food waste is a supply chain within itself, if we are to mobilize, where is the composting going? So thinking through that whole process, to me as a communicator, is understanding all the different stakeholders that needs to be communicated first before we get to the residents. Maybe the residents need to mobilize to communicate to their city officials, to their representative, that, hey, we believe in food waste solutions and composting is a strategy. How can you support a legislation to get behind of making the equipment and the infrastructure available for all of us to go zero waste for all? So when you begin that conversation on top of leveraging social media to tweet at your policymakers around going zero waste, going composting, these to me are there's a multi-level approach to get to the end goal, is what I'm trying to communicate ultimately. And so there is not one fast, quick answer to this, but there is an assumption made that there are already infrastructures in place to compost when that may not be the case, because obviously the conversation is also equity at the heart of everything. And some communities can compost easier than others. And so those dynamics have to be part of the conversation in order to communicate effectively and get to the desired outcome.
Thank you. So we've had another question put in the Q&A, and that is asking, is any food grown on campus? Tamber saying yes?
Yes, there is. There's the companion garden right next to the McKinley building that houses School of Communication, but also in the very back of AU. I don't even think people were touching the food. I wanted to gather food, but there is another garden growing. It was growing blueberries and kale and Swiss chard, so many different vegetables. So yes, AU period is, in my opinion, is a garden. If you actually like smell and touch the things that are growing, we have herbs and mints. And I would like to believe, and maybe we actually need to have signs like pick the food, like literally just put signs, because I'm with the Ziploc, like I'm sneaking, I'm getting some mint that's $2.99 at the grocery store. I'm saving me $3 right now and make some mint lemonade. So I think if we can just encourage about, foraging, like foraging AU hashtag, that would be awesome, because I became a forager during the midst of the pandemic too. There are blackberries growing at Kingman Island in Ward 7. I lived here for 13 plus years, didn't know this. So I think being able to encourage this idea, and I'm sure Garrett wants to chime in, so I'm just.
No, that's good. So everything Tamara just said, but just to kind of clarify, it's near the tennis courts. You have to go way back.
Yes, that's the one.
To the track, but it's a beautiful community garden. Shout out to the student leaders, Siddi and others. Fig trees, they're building an orchard. Very milpa, Mayan milpa, really intentional exploration, seed saving, composting. So it's beautiful. It's kind of not centered, I think, enough. It's such a beautiful space. So the little companion garden is more central to campus, but it's just a little sliver of land. So I think they're just the seeds of what's possible. The brilliant people who are at work in the Arboretum at the campus, Mike Mistrada, Stephanie, and others, they're very interested in edible landscapes. And so there's a big interest, but I feel like if the students demand it even more and get involved, it'll grow and flourish. And Airly, there's, Airly, AU bought Airly, or was gifted, Airly a few years ago. And so there's a farm out there that is growing food for TDR, but just last year, after a lot of us got together and we all kind of put our minds together, they're now growing food for the market, which is the student food pantry. And so this harvest is the first time where there's going to be food driven in from Fauquier County in Warren, Virginia, Airly about an hour outside of campus, to be grown in for the student food pantry. And that's just the beginning. There's so much potential to have more food production be part of, again, the curricular student campus experience and life, as well as the kind of intellectual foundation of what it means to be educated, is to have basic knowledge of food systems and food justice.
And just to be clear, students or anybody can pick the food. I don't want to get us in trouble. So
also 10 a.m. every Saturday, it's like volunteer, and the volunteers can like eat it all. I think everybody can come and gather because it's there for everyone, but volunteer every morning, and it's a beautiful community, 10 a.m. Saturdays.
And so you've answered, is the location of the gardens communicated to the students? So that's what you just told us, right? No.
Yes. Sorry, Tamara, I don't know if you have better directions than the tennis court, which might feel a little vague.
Okay, great. All right, so we are getting close to the end, and I want to give our panelists each an opportunity to give us their final thoughts on this particular award, on your work on sustainability at AU. I will let it be open to you as to what you would like your final thoughts with the audience to be. As I watch the Q&A to see if there are any final questions that do come in, but why don't we start with you? Garrett, and then I'll just go through the group.
I'll just end by reiterating kind of the main points, which is that food studies is a relatively new area of study in liberal arts education. It's historically been kind of ag extension, land grant schools, and then culinary schools. And the first round of it was good, but didn't have a strong enough equity lens. But right now there's such a burgeoning and really thriving critical agrarian studies, agri-food studies, bringing in racial justice, feminism, decoloniality, but also political economy and ecology and all the disciplines. So it's a really robust field within higher education right now from a research and a pedagogy perspective. And now from a campus life perspective is the next dimension in this kind of public outreach scholarship. So if this project feels very timely and very powerful with a lot of potential impact, even internationally. So I'll invite all the audience and the students and the parents to be involved and just end with gratitude.
Thank you. Tambra.
Given that our audience is during the family week, parents and students, I actually came from a land grant institution where we grow food on campus. So we're just, I'm just excited to know that there are other institutions beyond land grant concepts that can see themselves a part of this conversation of bringing research, education, and extension together. I think it's a universal concept that every university should really lift up and actualize. And so for those who are tuning in and thinking about, is there a career opportunity in food, and should I encourage my student to pursue? The beautiful piece about food is no matter what career path or major, let me be clear, it all intersects with food, whether you're at the School of Business, you're at the international school, the communication school, in particular is where I'll land the plane. When I thought about communication and health communication, I thought it was a very, very narrow area. But the reality is, with the emergence of digital platforms like Facebook and Twitter and more, this conversation of digital food studies has been unearthing. The book comes out of Australia with scholars there, and now conferences just dedicated in Europe on food communication. And so the beauty about being on the campus and being a part of projects like this is that knowledge is always growing and being cultivated, and you can be a part of that idea of, can I extend knowledge and improve society with new knowledge, and how can I play a role in being able to be that knowledge developer when so many times our communities may not feel that our knowledge is equally shared and valued. And for me, this is what it means to be hopefully the first PhD in my family to recognize that we have knowledge, we have ancestral knowledge, we have knowledge that is in our lived experience that must be valued, and that helps to contribute to bettering our communities and societies and really valuing ourselves as we navigate this world as humans on this journey. And so I'm happy to be a part of this journey of this human experience with everyone here tonight. And I hope that you go to the website and stay connected and follow the new Twitter account for Wasted Food, and just encourage us, because this work is not for the faint of heart, and to know that it will be worthwhile, but it's like the giving of birth. New life is being formed, and we hope that the world, even if it's just at AU, become just a little bit better because we came together.
Beautifully said. Simon.
You can't make me follow that, Diana. That's just not fair. Tambra, that was like everything I wish I could say. All I will say then is just to congratulate Swale, Garrett, Tambra, all of your collaborators just one more time on what is, to my memory at least, the largest grant that the university has been awarded. I think at least in recent memory, for this type of collaborative research, and so that needs to be recognized, I think, and applauded. It's a sign, Swale, that what you're doing is groundbreaking and will have impact, provided we give you the sort of support that you need to take it forward. And I'm looking forward to just kind of helping on the back end to make that all happen. Can't wait to see where this goes.
Swale.
So first, thank you all, and this, like I said, this work is the collaborators, but everyone at the community AU. Diana helped us practice with our presentation. We did horribly the first time. She told us what to do right the next time. Simon's been with us all the way. There's tons of other people, my entire department, everyone at AU is really chipped in. But I want to talk about, I think, and this often, sometimes not to get forgotten, but sometimes we don't realize it as faculty of who really pushes us to do creative work. And I really think it's the students that I go in and teach every day. I'm teaching the first years right now. And honestly, I walk in and they have the most creative ideas. Like they come to me and they say things that I'm like, I didn't even think about that. Like, where did you think, like, where were you thinking about something like that? And it's just being with the students at AU every day makes us like really push what we're doing. They've made me change the way I teach my classes because now I realize I'm like, they're at a point where they don't need certain types of things. They want us to go to the next level. And so in many ways, this grant, this idea of interdisciplinarity, this idea of getting to what the core of the problem is. Every student, like if I were to pick like what kind of makes the AU undergrad unique is that they love to go after a problem and solve it. Like they like get passionate about something and they go after it and they do it. And so I think that is where you all have driven research this way. And you all have driven us to kind of think about problems in a deeper way than just peripherally, working in our disciplines and thinking about it like academics do. So I do want to thank the AU students. And I guess that's my final thought. Like I'm most excited by everything every time I walk into class in the morning. I think I learn the most, and I'm most excited when I walk out. And now I'm most excited to engage with all the students that we're going to engage with on this grant. So yeah, I'll just leave that over there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Everything that you have all said, I couldn't have said it any better. I am just so grateful to have the opportunity to be in your presence, to be collaborators and journey on this journey to changing the world. We are truly living our change maker spirit. The ethos at AU is all about making an impact on the world and leaving the world just a little bit better than we found it. And so I truly appreciate all of you. I truly appreciate the audience. Thank you, students, family, staff members, community leaders, just all of you for hanging in there and listening for an hour and a half. I had an event last week and it was pouring down rain, and I said to the individuals in the room, the fact that you showed up means that you are ready to go on this journey with us. And I will say the same thing here this evening. The fact that you showed up at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening and stayed with us says that you are ready to take this journey with us. So please go to wastedfood.american.edu, wastedfood.american.edu, so that you can see everything that Swale and his team are doing. There are many additional members of the team, and we couldn't bring everybody on the screen tonight, but we hope that you will go and engage with him. Roll up your sleeves and help with this project. There are many different ways that you can assist. You see, we even came up with an idea this evening on the Zoom. So whoever that was who sent, it was an anonymous posting, but whoever you are, you have now launched a new project. So I encourage you to identify yourself with the faculty members here so that they can engage with you and we can get started. So thank you all very much. Everybody have a great evening and don't waste any food.